The equation appeared on the whiteboard like a death sentence. dx/dt equals k of a-x times b-x. Professor Blackwood turned to me with that smug smile and said, "Solve this." The entire lecture hall fell silent. 30 graduate students stared at the cleaning lady who'd just been publicly humiliated, waiting for me to crumble. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would be talked about in academic circles for years to come. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman with a PhD ended up pushing a mop, and how one arrogant professor's cruel joke backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I was invisible. That's exactly how I wanted it when I took the night cleaning job at Riverside University. Invisible meant I could listen to lectures through thin walls, could feed my starving intellect without anyone asking why a janitor knew advanced mathematics. Invisible meant I could grieve my destroyed career in peace while figuring out how to rebuild my shattered life. You see, 3 years ago, I was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, MIT PhD, rising star in computational mathematics. I had a corner office, research grants, and a future that sparkled like diamonds. Then my husband died in a car accident, my world imploded, and I discover I started playing a new group in a dark tribe. It was the most popular figure I've ever seen. Depression swallowed me whole. I lost my tenure-track position, and suddenly I was 42 years old, with no income, no references I could use, and a mind that felt like broken glass. But the brain doesn't forget calculus just because your heart is shattered. So when I found myself cleaning Professor Richard Blackwood's office at 2 a.m, listening to his pompous lectures about mathematical rigor, I couldn't help but notice he was wrong about half the time. Professor Blackwood was the kind of man who confused credentials with intelligence, who believed brilliance came with a price tag, and mine clearly wasn't expensive enough. He'd published exactly 3 papers in 20 years, all variations on the same tired theorem, but he carried himself like he'd personally invented integral calculus. His office was a shrine to academic mediocrity, walls lined with certificates that spoke more to persistence than genius. Every morning at precisely 8:15, he'd arrive with his leather briefcase and superiority complex, completely ignoring anyone he deemed beneath his notice. People like me. For 6 months, I'd been invisible to him. Not a nod, not a grunt, certainly not a thank you. I was just part of the furniture, as unremarkable as the desk I dusted or the floors I mopped. Which was perfect, because it meant I could eavesdrop on department meetings, could absorb mathematical discussions like a sponge, while everyone assumed I was too simple to understand. It was during one of these invisible moments that everything changed. I was emptying his wastebasket when I found a crumpled paper with a calculus problem scrawled across it in desperate red ink. A student had been struggling with optimization theory, trying to find the maximum volume of a cylinder inscribed in a cone. They'd made multiple attempts, each one getting closer, but never quite reaching the elegant solution that was practically screaming from the page. My fingers itched to grab a pen and show them the path they'd missed. But cleaning ladies don't solve calculus problems. They stay invisible and mind their own business. That's when I heard his voice in the hallway, dripping with that particular brand of academic arrogance that made my teeth ache. He was pontificating to a group of graduate students about the intellectual inferiority of, well, everyone who wasn't him. The problem with people today, Professor Blackwood announced, is that they think mathematics is democratic. They believe anyone can understand calculus with enough effort, as if mathematical insight were some kind of participation trophy. Lisa Peterson, a graduate student who'd always treated me with basic human decency, dared to challenge him. But Professor, couldn't someone develop mathematical intuition without formal training? Isn't it possible that understanding doesn't always require credentials? His laugh could have cut diamonds. Miss Peterson, mathematics isn't intuition. It's rigorous discipline earned through years of proper education. You can't stumble into understanding differential equations any more than you can stumble into performing neurosurgery. He paused, scanning the hallway with the predatory instinct of a man looking for prey. In fact, let me demonstrate exactly how absurd that notion is. That's when his eyes found me. I was standing there with my cleaning cart, duster in hand, trying to blend into the institutional beige walls like I had for months. But suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. His attention focused on me with laser intensity, and I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "You," he said, pointing at me with theatrical flourish. "What's your name?" Every instinct screamed at me to mumble something and disappear, but there was something in his tone that made my spine straighten. Something that reminded me of every professor, every colleague, every conference presenter who'd ever looked through me like I was transparent. "Elena," I said quietly. "Elena, tell me what you do here." "I clean the offices." His smile was razor sharp. "Exactly. And tell me, Elena, what's your educational background?" I could see where this was heading, could practically feel the trap closing around me. The graduate student shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty in their professor's tone. "High school." I lied, because the truth was too complicated and he didn't deserve it. "Perfect." He turned to address his audience like a ringmaster announcing the next act. "This is precisely what I mean about mathematical elitism being necessary rather than snobbish. Mathematics isn't for everyone, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to both the field and to people like Elena, who might waste valuable time attempting something beyond their intellectual capacity." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to choke on. I watched him stride toward his office, probably to fetch something that would make his point even more dramatically. The graduate students stood frozen, embarrassed by their professor's behavior, but too intimidated to speak up. Lisa Peterson caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," which was kind but unnecessary. I'd heard worse. I'd survived worse. Professor Blackwood returned with a piece of chalk and that same predatory smile. "Since we're discussing mathematical accessibility, let's conduct a little experiment." He walked to the nearest whiteboard and began writing an equation with deliberate theatrical slowness. The chalk scratched against the board like fingernails on glass, each symbol falling into place with calculated precision. "Let's see how intuitive mathematics really is," he announced to his captive audience. The equation stared back at us. dx.dt equals k of a dash x times b dash x. "This is a basic differential equation dealing with chemical reaction kinetics," he explained, turning back to face me with mock encouragement. Nothing too complicated for someone with natural mathematical intuition, surely. The graduate students looked mortified. I could feel their collective embarrassment radiating like heat from a fire, their discomfort at witnessing this public humiliation. They thought they were about to watch me crumble, thought they were about to be complicit in some cruel academic theater designed to prove their professor's point about intellectual hierarchies. Professor Blackwood stepped aside with a grand gesture, presenting the whiteboard like a game show host revealing a prize. "Go ahead, Elena. Solve it. Show us how democratic mathematics really is." The silence stretched between us like a tightrope. 30 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The stammered apology, the confirmation that their professor was right about people knowing their place. They had no idea they were about to witness the moment when invisible Elena Rodriguez stopped being invisible forever. I walked toward that whiteboard like I was walking toward my own execution. Every step felt deliberate, weighted with 3 years of suppressed brilliance and professional humiliation. My cleaning cart wheels squeaked against the polished floor, the only sound in hallway that had gone cemetery quiet. Professor Blackwood stood there with his arms crossed, practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. He thought he'd cornered a mouse, had no idea he'd just poked a sleeping dragon. The equation stared at me from the board. dx/dt equals k of a dash x times b dash x. It was a second-order reaction kinetics problem, the kind I used to solve in my sleep when I was researching computational chemistry applications. But standing there in my gray uniform, with 30 pairs of pitying eyes on me, I felt the weight of every assumption, every stereotype, every moment I'd been invisible, crashing down like an avalanche. "Take your time," Professor Blackwood said with mock kindness. I know it looks intimidating. That's when something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a rubber band that had been stretched too far for too long, finally reaching its breaking point. You know what? I was done being invisible. Done apologizing for taking up space. Done letting mediocre men with impressive titles make me feel small. I picked up the chalk, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. This is a second-order kinetics equation, I said, my voice steady and clear. The solution involves partial fraction decomposition. I began writing, muscle memory taking over as my hand moved across the board with practiced confidence. The chalk clicked against the surface in a rhythm that felt like coming home. I moved through the solution with the kind of fluid precision that comes from years of advanced study. My handwriting filled the board, equations flowing like water. I could feel my brain fully engaging for the first time since David died. Synapses firing in patterns I'd almost forgotten I possessed. Professor Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. I could see him trying to follow my work, probably recognizing that what I was doing was correct, but not quite believing it. The graduate students had gone silent in a completely different way now. Not the embarrassed silence of witnessing cruelty, but the focused attention of people watching something extraordinary unfold. I was in the zone now, completely absorbed in the mathematical dance. The cleaning cart, the uniform, the months of invisible servitude, all of it faded away until there was nothing but the pure logic of calculus flowing through my consciousness, like music. I worked through each step methodically, my solution building across the whiteboard with elegant precision. One of the graduate students, I think it was Marcus, the quiet one who worked on topology, whispered, "Holy shit." Professor Blackwood shot him a warning glare, but his heart wasn't in it. He was too busy trying to process what he was witnessing. His cleaning lady casually solving a differential equation that probably half his graduate students would struggle with. The final solution was taking shape, elegant in its complexity. I could feel the familiar satisfaction of mathematical completion, that moment when chaos resolves into perfect order. I set down the chalk and turned to face my audience. The silence was deafening. Professor Blackwood stood there with his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who'd just watched his worldview crumble in real time. The graduate students were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked suspiciously like awe. This solution describes the concentration of reactant over time in a second-order chemical reaction where two different species are consumed. It's commonly used in pharmaceutical kinetics and enzyme reaction modeling. I explained simply. Lisa Peterson was the first to find her voice. That's perfect. The solution is absolutely correct. She looked at Professor Blackwood with barely concealed challenge. Isn't it, Professor? The man who'd humiliated me moments before seemed to have temporarily lost the power of speech. He stared at the whiteboard like it might suddenly rearrange itself into something more manageable, something that didn't completely destroy his neat little theory about mathematical accessibility. Where did you learn this? He finally managed, his voice considerably smaller than it had been 5 minutes earlier. And here's where I could have been gracious. Could have mumbled something about online courses or community college classes. Could have let him save face and retreat back into his comfortable assumptions about intelligence and credentials. But you know what? Grace is overrated when you've been invisible for 6 months. YouTube, I said with a perfectly straight face. Definitely YouTube. Marcus snorted with barely suppressed laughter. Lisa was crooning openly now. Even the other graduate students seemed to be fighting smiles. Professor Blackwood's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade that reminded me of overcooked salmon. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You can't learn advanced calculus from YouTube videos. I shrugged, channeling every moment of frustration, every snubbed greeting, every time he'd looked through me like I was transparent. I guess mathematics is more democratic than you thought. The crowd was growing. Other faculty members had emerged from their offices, drawn by the commotion in the hallway. Dr. Martinez from the physics department pushed through the group and stopped short when she saw the whiteboard. Jesus, she breathed. Who solved this? The cleaning lady, Professor Blackwood said, and for the first time, those words didn't sound dismissive. They sounded like an accusation against the universe itself. Dr. Martinez looked from the board to me and back again. This is graduate-level work. Actually, it's better than graduate-level work. The presentation is cleaner than most journal papers I've reviewed. She turned to Professor Blackwood with barely concealed contempt. Richard, please tell me you didn't use this woman as some kind of demonstration prop. The flush on his face deepened. I was merely illustrating the point about mathematical prerequisites. By humiliating someone publicly? Dr. Martinez's voice could have frozen helium. What kind of educational philosophy thinks public embarrassment is appropriate pedagogy? More faculty were arriving, words spreading through the department like wildfire. I could see Professor Blackwood calculating the damage to his reputation, realizing that his cruel little demonstration had backfired spectacularly. The cleaning lady he tried to use as an example of mathematical inadequacy had just shown up half as faculty. Elena? Dr. Martinez said, turning to me with something that looked like respect. Would you mind if I asked about your background? Because what you just did suggests considerably more training than YouTube videos. And there it was. The moment of truth. I could keep lying, could maintain the fiction that I was just an exceptionally motivated janitor with a gift for mathematics, or I could stop being invisible forever. I looked at the crowd of academics surrounding me, at Professor Blackwood's mortified face, at the whiteboard covered with my work. Then I looked at Lisa Peterson, who'd been kind to me when I was nobody, who'd stood up to her professor when it mattered. She deserved honesty. They all did. MIT, I said simply. PhD in computational mathematics, class of 2018. You could have heard a pin drop in that hallway. Professor Blackwood's face went from salmon pink to ash gray in about 3 seconds flat. The graduate students looked like they'd been struck by lightning. Dr. Martinez slowly turned to stare at Professor Blackwood with an expression that could 1,500. I was half the kind of student and no one was. I was constantly blocking in misery and fear.
Richard,
She said, her voice dangerously quiet. Did you just attempt to publicly humiliate someone with a PhD from MIT? She said she only had a high school education. He stammered, grasping for any defense that might save him from complete professional destruction. She lied. I felt a laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest, the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. I lied because you didn't deserve the truth. Because you looked at me and decided my worth based on my uniform instead of asking who I was. Because you thought cruelty disguised as education was acceptable as long as your victim was beneath your notice. Dr. Patterson, the department chair, pushed through the crowd with an expression that suggested Professor Blackwood's day was about to get considerably worse. Someone want to explain what's happening here? Professor Blackwood decided to use me as a demonstration prop. I said, my voice steady and clear. He wanted to prove that mathematics isn't democratic by asking the cleaning lady to solve a differential equation. It didn't go quite how he planned. Dr. Patterson's eyes moved to the whiteboard, scanning the elegant solution. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked suspiciously like fury. Richard, he said, did you seriously attempt to humiliate a member of our staff for educational theater? I didn't know she was qualified, Professor Blackwood said weakly. The point was to demonstrate. The point, Dr. Martinez interrupted, was to be cruel, and it spectacularly backfired. She turned to me with admiration. Dr. Rodriguez, that solution is beautiful. The clarity of presentation, the logical flow, it's exactly what I'd hoped to see from someone with your credentials. Dr. Patterson was looking at me with recognition. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Computational mathematics. I remember your name from journal articles. Didn't you publish that landmark paper on stochastic differential equations in complex systems? 3 papers, actually. I said, feeling more like myself with every word. The media in the future is all on the way. It's the life of the peak. Before my world fell apart and I became invisible. Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Patterson said carefully, would you be interested in having a conversation about your future here? Because I'm thinking we might have better use for your talents than custodial work. I looked at the whiteboard one more time, at the mathematical proof of my own competence. Then I looked at Professor Blackwood, who seemed to be trying to disappear into the institutional beige walls. I'd like that conversation, I said. But first, I have offices to finish cleaning. Some of us honor our commitments, regardless of our qualifications. As I turned to walk back to my card, I heard Lisa Peterson whisper to one of her classmates, "Best day of graduate school ever." Professor Blackwood stood there in the wreckage of his demonstration, surrounded by colleagues who were looking at him like he'd committed academic suicide, which, honestly, he pretty much had. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Dr. Patterson's office wearing actual professional clothes for the first time in 3 years, negotiating the terms of my return to academia. The conversation had led to a formal meeting with the university's hiring committee, which had led to an offer I never expected. A full professorship with tenure track, teaching advanced calculus and differential equations. But the story everyone really wanted to hear wasn't about my triumphant return to respectability. It was about what happened to Professor Richard Blackwood in the aftermath of his spectacular miscalculation. Academic communities are small, gossipy places where news travels faster than light, and the story of a department head trying to humiliate a janitor who turned out to be more qualified than half his faculty was too good not to share. By the end of that first day, it had spread beyond Riverside University to the broader mathematical community, carried by email chains and social media posts, and the kind of academic networking that turns local scandal into discipline-wide legend. The video didn't help his case. Yes, there was video. Marcus, the topology graduate student, had been recording Professor Blackwood's impromptu lecture on his phone when the whole thing started, and he'd kept recording through my mathematical demolition of his professor's worldview. By the time I finished solving that differential equation and revealed my credentials, Marcus had 23 minutes of footage showing exactly how cruel academic elitism could be and how spectacularly it could backfire. He posted it to TikTok with the caption, "Professor tries to humiliate janitor, immediately regrets it." And by morning, it had 500,000 views. By the end of the week, it was approaching 10 million. The comments section was brutal. How much parties influence the public? Discomfit. Imagine being shown up by someone you tried to humiliate, was one of the kinder observations. I worked in the darkroom with so many indescribable disparity and suffering, and moved to the pressure of the parts. I see at one point where the moment I realized that this moment isn't right. It was the Father of Man. This is what happens when you confuse credentials with intelligence was another. My personal favorite was, Professor discovers that PhD stands for pretty hard destruction when you mess with the wrong person. Academic Twitter absolutely lost its collective mind. Mathematicians from around the world were sharing the video, commenting on the elegance of my solution, and dragging Professor Blackwood's reputation through the digital mud with surgical precision. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Harvard posted, "This is a masterclass in both differential equations and how not to treat people. The mathematics is beautiful. The human behavior is ugly." Dr. Michael Torres from Berkeley added, "I've used Dr. Rodriguez's research in my own work for years. The fact that someone with her credentials was pushing a mop while this mediocrity was running a department says everything about what's wrong with academia. But the real damage came from the investigation that followed. Dr. Patterson, mortified that his department had harbored both a hidden genius and a publicly cruel department head, decided to take a closer look at Professor Blackwood's academic record. What he found wasn't pretty. Those 3 papers I mentioned, 2 of them had serious methodological flaws that should have been caught in peer review. The third was based on data that couldn't be replicated. Professor Blackwood had been coasting on his initial appointment for 2 decades, doing the bare minimum while contributing virtually nothing to mathematical knowledge. Meanwhile, I had 17 peer-reviewed publications, 3 major grants, and research that was still being cited years after I'd disappeared from academic life. The contrast was devastating, and it raised uncomfortable questions about how Professor Blackwood had maintained his position while more qualified candidates had been pushed out of the field. The university administration, already embarrassed by the viral video and the negative attention it was bringing to Riverside, decided that Professor Blackwood's particular brand of leadership was no longer aligned with their institutional values. They offered him early retirement, which in academic terms is polite code for, "Leave now, or we'll make your life miserable until you do." He took the offer. But here's the thing about academic scandal. It follows you. Professor Blackwood's name was now permanently associated with the phrase, "tried to humiliate a janitor who had a PhD from MIT." Every job application, every conference proposal, every attempt to maintain professional credibility would be shadowed by those 23 minutes of video evidence showing exactly who he was when he thought nobody important was watching. The morning he cleaned out his office, I was there. Not because I wanted to gloat, but because it was Tuesday, and Tuesday was when I cleaned that wing of the building. I was still technically a custodian for another week, until my new position officially began, and I honored my commitments. He looked up as I entered with my cart, and for a moment we just stared at each other. The powerful department head and the invisible cleaning lady, except now the power dynamic had completely flipped. He was packing books into boxes with the defeated movements of a man whose worldview had collapsed, while I was days away from stepping into a position that commanded more respect than his had ever earned. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "but I never intended for things to go this far." I considered his words, weighing them against 6 months of invisibility, against years of similar treatment in academic settings, against the casual cruelty he thought was acceptable as long as the audience agreed his victim deserved it. "The problem, Richard," I said, using his first name deliberately, "isn't that things went too far. The problem is that you thought any of it was acceptable to begin with." He flinched at the truth of it. "I didn't know you were qualified." "You didn't ask. You looked at my uniform and decided my value as a human being. You used me as a prop in your little theater of superiority, without considering that I might have feelings, might have dignity, might have worth beyond my ability to solve your equations." I emptied his wastebasket, the final time I would perform that particular service. "The tragedy isn't that you got caught, Richard. The tragedy is that you needed to get caught to understand why what you did was wrong." As I pushed my cart toward the door, he called after me, "For what it's worth, your solution was elegant. Better than anything I could have produced." I paused in the doorway. "I know," I said simply. "I've always known." That afternoon, I had my final conversation with Dr. Martinez about my upcoming position. We discussed course loads and research opportunities and the kind of institutional support that would help me rebuild the career I'd thought was lost forever. But she also wanted to talk about the elephant in the room, the viral video and the attention it had brought to our little university. "You've become something of a folk hero." "Yes," she said with a smile. "The mathematician who solved more than just equations. Students are calling you the calculus crusader. They're memes." I groaned. "Please tell me they're not terrible." "Oh, they're wonderful. My favorite shows your solution on the whiteboard with the caption, 'When you're overqualified for the comeback.' There's another one that's just a picture of a cleaning cart with stealth mode, engaged, written underneath." Despite everything, I laughed. Academic fame in the digital age. My grandmother would have been so confused. Your grandmother would have been proud. Dr. Martinez said seriously, "What you did wasn't just mathematically impressive. It was morally necessary. You showed an entire generation of students that intelligence comes in many forms, that credentials don't equal character, and that cruelty disguised as education is still just cruelty." She was right, of course. The video had sparked conversations in academic departments across the country about treatment of staff, about assumptions based on appearances, about the difference between being educated and being intelligent. Professor Blackwood's cruel demonstration had backfired in ways he could never have imagined, becoming a teaching moment about respect and humanity that reached far beyond mathematics. As I left her office for the last time as a custodian, I passed the whiteboard where everything had changed. Someone had written, Dr. Rodriguez's theorem, intelligence is not determined by uniform, in neat mathematical notation. Below it, in different handwriting, someone had added, proof, see attached video. I smiled and took a picture. Some equations are worth remembering. 3 months later, I stood at the front of a lecture hall filled with students eager to learn differential equations from the professor who'd become internet famous for solving them under pressure. My first lecture was standing room only, with students from other departments auditing just to see the calculus crusader in action. But as I looked out at those eager faces, I realized that my story wasn't really about mathematical prowess, or viral videos, or academic comebacks. It was about visibility, about the courage to stop hiding, to step out of the shadows and claim the space you've earned, about understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be invisible anymore. The first time this process was fixed, it was crossed. Today we're going to solve some differential equations, I told my students, picking up a piece of chalk that felt like coming home. But first, let me tell you about the day I stopped being invisible, and how a single equation changed everything. The room was silent, attentive, ready to learn not just mathematics, but the lesson that Professor Blackwood had inadvertently taught, that intelligence, dignity, and worth aren't determined by titles or uniforms or assumptions. They're determined by what you do when someone gives you a piece of chalk and challenges you to prove who you really are. And sometimes, just sometimes, the answer is more beautiful than anyone expected.